All right, everybody, let's talk about Chapter 2, Understanding the Elements of Language. And we'll be talking about, for a really long time, we talked about language just in five domains: phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. Bloom and Leahy in 78 came up with this, but it's only maybe the last 10 or 20 years that really then we've broken things down into form, content, and use pretty widely as a field, I think. And it really helps, I think, to think about, all right, is this a form issue? Is this a content issue? Or is this a use issue when we have a client in front of us? So let's start by talking about form. And phonology is the study of the sound system of language. And a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound in speech. And a good way to think about that is by thinking about minimal pairs. And a minimal pair is two words that only differ by one sound. So pat and bat, now and cow, and thought and caught, right? We just have one, so that one sound changes the entire word. So that sound, therefore, is a phoneme because it's important in speech. And the minimal pair, again, is two words that differ by only one sound. There are 43-ish phonemes in English, depending on your dialect. You could have one more, one less, but around 43. And what's hard, right, is we've only got 26 letters. So the letter A can say A, it can make or as in can, and lots of variations of that, really, even. So, letters can sound differently depending on the word, their placement. So that's one of the reasons why reading is a lot harder than it needs to be, especially in English. Not that, people around the world, depending on language, are going to have difficulties, but English is especially a difficult language. And some terms we need to know. One is phonotactic constraint, and a phonotactic constraint is which sounds can and cannot go together. And so think about the word like blue. So you can start a word with BL, right? Blue, black, blaze. That's pretty common, but you can't really start a word with LB, right? It just doesn't work. So that's a phonotactic constraint, right? You can start words can start with BL, but can't start with LB. And there are a lot of constraints like that. We don't think about them, but they're there. But even with those constraints, right, there are millions and millions of words, and there are new words happening all the time. And phonology and form are made up of rules and constraints, right? Things you can and can't do. And yet within these rules, language is an amazingly rich thing. All right, still talking about form. Morphology is the study of the structure of words. The term morphology is Greek, and it's a makeup of morph, meaning shape or form, and ology, which means the study of something. So it's the study of the shape or the structure of words and word meaning. And a morpheme is the smallest meaningful unit in a language. So not a sound, but meaningful unit. And the best way we can explain it is to talk about the two different kinds: free morphemes and bound morphemes. Free morphemes can stand on their own as meaningful words. So the word right, is a free morpheme. It has meaning all by itself. You can't break word down anymore. It is its own thing. But we also have morphemes that only have meaning when attached to other morphemes, and those are bound morphemes. So one good example is plural s is a bound morpheme, right? So words, you've got two morphemes there. You've got the morpheme word, and you've got the bound morpheme plural s, which means more than one, right? But if you just have an s there by itself, it has no meaning. So free morphemes and bound morphemes. A bound morpheme could be at the beginning of the word with prefix. So un, unknown, right, adds a morpheme, but just the un doesn't have any meaning unless it's attached to a free morpheme. Suffixes come after the words. Plural s, ing, ed are all examples of suffixes that are bound morphemes. Last term here, and this helps us see the connection a little bit between morphology and phonology. An allomorph, when a unit of meaning varies in sound without changing the meaning. So that plural s in cats versus dogs, right? Dogs in cats, because cat ends in an unvoiced sound, the plural s is pronounced s, is the phoneme s. Whereas in dogs, because the g is voiced, we're going to voice the z at the end of that. Dogs, 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 dogs. So therefore, it's a different sound, but yet it doesn't change the meaning, right? So that plural s, it doesn't matter how you say it, how you pronounce it, or what phoneme it is, it still has meaning. All right, syntax. I don't want to talk about syntax a lot now. We'll talk about syntax more when we talk about child language disorders. Syntax, we'll just go with the set of rules, principles, and processes that govern the structure of sentences in a given language. So phonemes are really the rules, principles, and processes that govern the structure of sound in the language. Morpheme is the same thing for the smallest meaningful units of words in a language. And syntax is the rules and structure of sentences in a language. All right, so that was all form. Now we get to content, right? So, and the only part of content is semantics. Semantics is the study of how meaning is attached to words and sentences. So content, semantics, think meaning, think vocabulary, and think word finding are two of the biggest areas that speech pathologists have to work on and are that involved with kids and adults. So, and meaning was really important. So Noam Chomsky was, one of the big founders of the study of language, and he was a big linguist, and he's still around and still talks. And so he believed that grammar was innate in humans, that all humans had grammar, so that we had the rules and processes for just the basic ideas of language when we were born, so that was like innate with us. But he also knew that language didn't mean anything if it didn't have meaning, that one of the purposes of language was to provide meaning, right? So he famously used the sentence, "Colorless green ideas sleep furiously," right, to discuss that. So that is a perfectly grammatically correct sentence. The form is correct, but it's meaningless, so it's really useless, right? So you've got the form, but the content, the semantics have to be present for it to be worthwhile. Also, for language to be worthwhile is the idea of use, and pragmatics is the study of the rules that govern how we use language. And one of the big ideas here is that language has function, right? One of the functions is to convey meaning from one person to another, but it also has other functions. And so we can talk about speech acts, which just again, the idea that words influence listeners, that saying is doing, that you're conveying a thought, or you're asking a question, or you're giving an order to tell people to do something. And there are two kinds of speech acts. There's a direct speech act and an indirect speech act. A direct speech act would be if you're sitting near the window and I ask you, please close the window, right? That's a direct speech act. I'm telling you what to do. An indirect speech act is when the syntactic form does not exactly match the communicative intention. So there are two other ways I could ask you to close the window that would both be indirect. One would be from me saying, whew, it is cold in here, right? And if you're sitting by that open window, maybe, I'm saying that it's cold, but I'm also telling you to close the window indirectly, right? So that's indirect. But also indirect would be, can you close the window, right? Because that's really a yes or no question, right? So if I say, can you close the window? And you say yes, but then you don't close the window, well, you've answered my question, but you haven't done what I actually wanted you to do. So those are indirect speech acts. And that's a good little site if you want to check that out, to visit that. Lastly, we're going to talk about Grice's maxims. We're talking about pragmatics, and there's a YouTube clip that you can watch. We watched part of it in class. And Grice said that there's 4 things that speakers need to do in conversation to be useful. One is quantity. You want to give as much information as needed, but no more. If you don't give me enough information, I can't complete the task. If you give me so much information that I'm overwhelmed, I can't complete the task because what you want gets lost in all the words you give me, right? Quality of the information. If what you tell me is untrue or just worthless, right? I'm going to figure that out, and then maybe I'm not going to talk to you next time, or if I do talk to you, right, I'm not going to think about what you're saying and take you seriously. So you need to be truthful. Language also has to have relation, so it's got to be relevant to the conversation. Right, we've got to be, if we're having a conversation, right, I talk, you talk, I talk, you talk, I talk, you talk, and we're talking about the same topic. We're not, you're talking about one thing and I'm talking about something completely different. That doesn't make any sense, and we're not going anywhere, right? The idea is that we're trying to go somewhere. We're trying to have a conversation and be productive here. So things have to be relevant. And then Grice also talked about the manner in which you have the conversation, to try to be clear, brief, and orderly. If things are all over the place, if things are a mess, it's going to be hard for the other person to follow along. It doesn't mean they can't be that way, but it just makes it harder. So the more clear, the more brief, and the more orderly we can be, the better off the conversation is. Okay? And that is it for Chapter 2.